A poor young woman was forced to marry a wealthy older man. When she arrived at the mansion and met his children, she was immediately shocked to see that. Jessica stared at herself in the mirror, unable to recognize the woman staring back. Her reflection showed a flawless bride, the white dress fitting her perfectly, the veil carefully placed, and makeup enhancing her youth and beauty. But behind that image of perfection, there was a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. She had never imagined her life would come to this. As her hands slightly trembled over the bouquet, memories of how she ended up here flooded her mind. Just a year ago, Jessica dreamt of a future full of love with David, her first great love. But those dreams shattered when he left her without an explanation, choosing another woman. That betrayal broke her heart, and in that pain she made the decision to marry Richard. "Jessica, are you ready?" Her younger sister Valeria's soft voice broke the silence in the room. Valeria watched her with concern, aware that the sparkle in her sister's eyes wasn't happiness, but resignation. "Yes, ready," Jessica replied with a forced smile, though inside she felt like an actress in a play she hadn't chosen to star in. When Valeria left to inform the others, Jessica allowed herself one more moment in front of the mirror. "Why am I doing this?" she thought. She knew the answer, though she didn't want to admit it. She was marrying Richard, a wealthy older man, not out of love but out of spite. It was a way to escape the pain David had caused her. If he could move on with his life, so could she. Even if it was with a man she didn't love. The sound of the wedding music pulled her out of her thoughts. It was time. She took a deep breath, tried to calm her nerves, and walked out of the room ready to face her new reality. As she reached the altar, the first thing she saw was Richard waiting for her, serious and elegant, in a black suit that fit him perfectly. Despite his grey hair, he still had an attractiveness that made him stand out. His firm posture and unshaken face reflected a man used to having control over everything. However, there was something unsettling in his eyes. There was no tenderness or love, just coldness and calculation. But Jessica already knew that. From the beginning, this union had been more of a deal than a true commitment of hearts. The murmurs of the guests barely reached her. Around her, the smiling faces of family and friends blurred, as if her mind were trying to block out everything around her. Each step toward Richard felt heavier than the last, but there was no turning back. She couldn't back out now. Richard extended his hand when she reached him, and Jessica took it without hesitation. His skin was cold to the touch, and the slight squeeze he gave her felt like a silent warning. This marriage was no fairy tale. "You look beautiful," Richard whispered without apparent emotion, as if merely fulfilling the formality of saying it. Jessica just nodded, unsure of how to respond. She knew that now, more than ever, she was about to leave behind the life she once dreamed of. Her gaze wandered for a second among the guests, searching for a familiar face, something that could connect her to the life she had before all this. And it was at that moment that her eyes locked with a man's in the back of the room. Michael, Richard's nephew, was watching her from his seat, apart from the crowd, with an intense gaze that Jessica couldn't immediately decipher. He was young, probably closer to her age than Richard's, and there was something about his expression that disturbed her. It wasn't the first time she had seen him. They had met briefly a few days ago at a family dinner, but that first encounter had been short and distant. However, now his presence made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. The priest began the ceremony, and the words echoed in the air like a distant sound to Jessica. She was lost in her own thoughts, in the emptiness that consumed her. She knew she didn't love Richard, but she also knew that somehow this marriage would provide her with stability, something she had come to value in her painful process of mourning David. But at what cost? "Do you take Richard as your husband?" The priest's voice pulled her from her reverie. Jessica hesitated for just a second. Then she took a deep breath and answered with the same coldness with which she had entered this relationship. "Yes, I do." The silence inside her contrasted with the applause of the guests. The act was done. Jessica had sealed her fate, at least for now. As she walked arm in arm with Richard towards the exit of the hall, the stairs remained fixed on them, but the only gaze Jessica could feel was Michael's, who hadn't stopped watching her for a moment. That night, as the reception continued with superficial conversations and forced toasts, Jessica tried to play her role as a wife, but the tension in her body was palpable. Every time Michael's eyes landed on her, she felt a strange mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. Finally, when the night began to wind down and the guests dispersed, Jessica retreated to her room, exhausted, more emotionally than physically. She closed the door behind her and leaned against the frame, allowing herself for the first time that day a deep sigh. Reality had hit her with full force. She had married a man she didn't love, for reasons she couldn't justify even to herself. Yet as her thoughts sank into fatigue and confusion, she couldn't shake the image of Michael from her mind. There was something in his gaze that promised trouble, a silent promise that this marriage would be much more complicated than she had imagined. The day after the wedding, Richard's house was quieter than usual. The staff was cleaning up the remnants of the reception from the previous night, and the sun was just beginning to light up the large windows of the hall. Jessica, now officially Richard's wife, woke up with a strange sensation in her chest. The night had been long, full of unfamiliar faces, empty conversations, and the constant feeling of being trapped in a life that wasn't hers. She slowly rose from the bed, looking around the enormous bedroom she now had to sleep in every night. Everything in Richard's house was imposing and cold, from the high ceilings to the luxurious furniture. It was a house that, despite its luxury, offered no comfort. She walked to the balcony, seeking a breath of fresh air as if that could clear her thoughts. As she gazed out at the garden, lost between shadows and rays of sunlight, memories of the previous night returned. She had done her duty of smiling and thanking the guests. She had been the perfect wife everyone expected. But throughout the night, the image of one face had remained etched in her mind. Michael. Michael. That name echoed in her head. The way he had looked at her during the reception, distant yet piercing, had disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't a superficial glance, but one that seemed to have emotionally stripped her, something even Richard hadn't managed to do. Although she barely knew him, there was something about Michael that deeply intrigued her. However, her life was now tied to Richard, and any thoughts about Michael had to be erased immediately. He was her husband's nephew, and nothing more. When she came down to breakfast, she found Richard reviewing some documents, as if the wedding from the day before had been nothing more than a routine event in his busy schedule. He barely looked up to greet her. "Did you sleep well?" he asked without genuine interest in the answer. "Yes, thank you," Jessica replied with a polite smile. As she sat at the table, she noticed Richard was deeply engrossed in what he was doing. Silently, she wondered if her life would always be like this, accompanied by a man who, despite his promises of stability, was incapable of showing her affection. Just as the atmosphere was becoming more uncomfortable, the dining room door opened, and Michael entered. His presence immediately changed the room's energy. He was dressed casually, but his bearing and confidence filled the space in a way Jessica hadn't noticed before. "Uncle, can I interrupt you for a moment?" Michael said, throwing a quick glance at Jessica before focusing on Richard. Richard looked up, somewhat annoyed by the interruption, but nodded. "Go ahead, Michael, what do you need?" "I just wanted to confirm the meeting this afternoon. I'd like to go over the details before the partners arrive," Michael said with the calm of someone used to handling important situations. Jessica observed the interaction, noticing the formality between them. There were no signs of a warm relationship between uncle and nephew. It was more like a constant business transaction. "I'll do it after breakfast," Richard replied without losing his composure. Then, with a brief gesture, he added, "And if you don't mind, Michael, I'd like a moment alone with Jessica before we start the day." Michael nodded, but before leaving, his eyes returned to Jessica. This time, there was no doubt that the look held something more than simple courtesy. It was a curious gaze, as if he were trying to read what lay behind the facade Jessica was trying to maintain. It was only an instant, but Jessica felt her heart quicken slightly. Of course, sorry for the interruption, Jessica," Michael said with a slight smile before exiting the dining room. When the door closed, silence filled the room again, but this time, the tension was palpable. Jessica tried to focus on her breakfast, but the conflicting emotions Michael stirred in her kept her distracted. She was aware that something deeper was brewing within her, though she couldn't allow herself to follow those thoughts. Not now. "Michael is very capable," Richard suddenly said without lifting his eyes from his documents, as if he had read her thoughts. "He's young, but he understands how business works. Someday, if he follows in my footsteps, he'll go far." Jessica just nodded. She didn't know how to respond to that. What she did know was that for as capable as Michael was in business, there was something in his gaze that unsettled her. It was as if Michael carried a layer of mystery, something Richard either didn't see or didn't want to see. The day passed without incident, but Jessica couldn't stop thinking about that brief encounter. Michael's interest seemed more than professional, and for the first time since her wedding, Jessica felt a spark within her, a spark that scared and excited her at the same time. That afternoon, while walking through the garden, she heard voices coming from Richard's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she recognized Michael's voice. He was speaking in a low tone, but with an intensity that caught her attention. For a moment she hesitated whether to approach, but something inside her urged her to listen. "It's not just the business, Uncle. There's more at stake than you think," Michael said, his voice tinged with concern. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Michael," Richard replied coldly. "Trust me, everything is under control." Jessica stepped back, her heart pounding. What were they talking about? Curiosity began to grow inside her, not just about the family business, but about the relationship between Richard and Michael. And more importantly, about the role she herself would play in all of this. She knew something was hidden, something beyond her marriage to Richard. And although she didn't want to admit it, the figure of Michael lingered in her mind like an intriguing shadow, promising to reveal darker secrets than she was prepared to face. With a mix of unease and curiosity, Jessica decided she couldn't ignore those feelings any longer. She didn't know where they would lead her, but something inside told her that Michael and his relationship with Richard were key to uncovering what was really happening in her new life. This time, she wouldn't let herself be easily trapped. Weeks passed in Richard's house with the monotony Jessica had come to fear. The day of her wedding had been only the beginning of a life marked by cold and distant luxury, where emotions were relegated to the background. Richard remained the same man she had met, calculating, methodical, and always focused on his business. But something had changed in Jessica. Even though she had tried to ignore her thoughts and desires, Michael's presence had become impossible to dismiss. Richard, for his part, seemed unaware, or if he was, he hid it well. He was always busy, meeting with partners, attending social events, or locked in his office. He barely exchanged words with Jessica beyond necessary courtesies, and she began to feel that her marriage was little more than a facade. One afternoon, while Richard was at one of his meetings, Jessica decided to escape to the garden for some fresh air. The hours spent inside the house were starting to weigh on her, and the fresh breeze offered her at least a temporary respite. She walked along the flowered paths, enjoying the sound of the wind moving through the leaves and the distant song of the birds. It was then that she saw him again, Michael, walking towards her from the other end of the garden. Their eyes met, and for a second, the world seemed to stop. Every time she saw him, she felt something beyond mere attraction. There was a connection between them that she couldn't deny, although she knew it was dangerous. "Do you need to escape too?" Michael said with a smile, approaching her with the same natural ease he displayed in the house. Jessica smiled faintly but didn't reply immediately. She couldn't admit aloud what she was beginning to feel for him. Still, her heart raced faster whenever he was near. "Sometimes I feel like this house is a cage," she finally replied, her voice sounding more vulnerable than she had intended. Michael watched her for a few seconds before nodding, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. He stepped a little closer and stopped by her side, also gazing out at the horizon. "You're not the only one who feels that way," he said softly. Jessica looked at him curiously. She knew little about Michael beyond the fact that he was Richard's nephew and worked with him in the family business. However, there was something in him, a sadness or perhaps a hidden frustration, that intrigued her. She wanted to know more, but feared opening a door she wouldn't be able to close. "It's hard to imagine you feeling trapped. You seem to have everything you want," Jessica commented, trying to keep her tone casual. Michael looked at her for a moment, his expression darkening slightly. "What you see isn't always what it seems, Jessica. There are many things at play that you couldn't even imagine." The seriousness of his words left her unsettled. It was clear that Michael had his own secrets, and the tension between them was becoming more and more palpable. Before she could ask more, Michael changed the subject with a forced smile. "How about we take a walk? This place can be more enjoyable if you don't wander alone." Jessica hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. She knew she shouldn't allow this relationship to grow beyond mere courtesy, but there was something irresistible about Michael's company. Together, they walked through the gardens, talking about trivial things, but with each step, the connection between them deepened. What neither of them knew was that from the shadows of a window on the second floor, Richard was watching. He had noticed the exchanges between Jessica and Michael for weeks. He had sensed the change in his wife's attitude, the way her eyes brightened slightly when Michael was near. None of it came as a surprise to Richard. In fact, he had expected it. From the moment he had decided to marry Jessica, Richard knew that the attraction between his nephew and his new wife was inevitable. He had seen it before, even they were aware of it themselves. But far from feeling betrayed or angry, Richard saw it as an opportunity. He had calculated each of his moves from the start. Jessica and Michael were nothing more than pieces on his board, pawns in a much larger game that they didn't even suspect existed. That same night, Richard decided to approach Jessica in a way he hadn't since their wedding. When she entered the room after dinner, she found him sitting in an armchair quietly reading. It was rare to see him there, as he usually spent the nights in his office. "Is everything okay?" Jessica asked, feeling somewhat uncomfortable with his sudden presence. "I was wondering if we could talk," Richard said, setting the book aside and standing up to approach her. Jessica watched him cautiously. Conversations with Richard were usually brief and to the point, with no room for emotions or personal discussions. "Sure, what do you want to talk about?" she replied, trying to sound calm. Richard looked at her steadily for a long second before speaking. "I know you feel lonely here, Jessica," he began, his tone soft but full of hidden intentions. "And I know this probably wasn't the marriage you dreamed of, but what I don't want is for you to feel trapped." Richard's words sounded strange to her ears. Jessica didn't know where he was going with this, but something in his tone made her suspicious. "I'm fine," Jessica lied, although they both knew it wasn't true. Richard smiled slightly, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. "You have Michael," he said suddenly, without beating around the bush. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Michael in that context took her by surprise. What did Richard know? How much did he know about the relationship she had been developing with his nephew? "I don't understand what you mean," she said, trying to stay calm. Richard stepped closer, his smile turning into something darker. "You don't have to hide it, Jessica. I know you spend time with him. In fact, I encourage it. I want you to feel comfortable here. And if Michael can offer you something that I can't, then so be it." Richard's words were neither permission nor a warning. They were something much more twisted, a carefully laid trap. Jessica stared at him, stunned, not knowing how to react. "All I ask is that you stay by my side," Richard continued, now with a coldness that sent shivers down her spine. "You can enjoy Michael's company as much as you want, but remember that this marriage is what matters most." Jessica couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as if Richard were allowing, even encouraging, her relationship with his nephew, but under terms she didn't fully understand. Her mind raced to process what she had just heard, but one thing was clear. Richard wasn't the man she thought he was. And their marriage, far from being a mere transaction, was part of a much darker and more twisted plan than she had imagined. The day after the shocking conversation with Richard, Jessica found herself sitting in the mansion's main hall, watching the afternoon sun filter through the windows. It had been days since that unsettling talk, but the unease still clung to her chest. Her husband knew about her relationship with Michael, and not only did he know, he encouraged it in a twisted way. But why? That was the question that kept gnawing at her. Richard's behavior was too strange. There was no trace of jealousy, no resentment. Quite the opposite. He seemed to be controlling every situation, every emotion, as if he were moving the pieces of a chessboard. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind his apparent indifference. She was starting to suspect she was being used, but she didn't know how or for what. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her out of her thoughts. When she turned, she saw Michael entering the hall, with the same calm control that characterized him. The air grew heavier as their eyes met. Jessica felt the tension between them growing stronger, as if they both knew a truth was waiting to be revealed. "I needed to see you," Michael said quietly, stopping a few steps away from her. Jessica nodded. She had been thinking about him too. Since the last time they had spoken in the garden, something had changed between them. It was no longer just attraction or curiosity. Now there was an invisible barrier, a mixture of distrust and restrained emotion. "There's something I need to know, Michael," Jessica began, with a firmness that surprised even herself. "What's going on between you and Richard? What are you not telling me?" The question hung in the air, creating an uncomfortable silence. Michael looked at her with a mix of doubt and resignation. He knew he couldn't keep hiding the truth, but he also feared the consequences of revealing it. "Jessica, there are things you wouldn't easily understand," he finally said, his voice tense. "This goes beyond what you think, beyond what we ourselves could have imagined." Jessica crossed her arms, her frustration growing. "Don't try to protect me with more lies. I already know Richard is playing me, and I know you're part of it too. Just tell me the truth." Michael sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair with a worried gesture. "All right, you deserve to know," he conceded, his tone softer. "But you have to promise me you won't do anything impulsive. What's at stake here is much bigger than you can imagine." Jessica stared at him, unblinking. "Tell me," she insisted. Michael paused before speaking, as if carefully choosing his words. "Richard isn't just the businessman you think he is. He's been involved in a lot of dark things throughout his life, and what he wants most is to maintain control over everything and everyone around him. That control is what keeps him in power." Jessica frowned, confused. She knew Richard was a cold and calculating man, but she had never imagined he was involved in something as dark as Michael was suggesting. "And what do I have to do with all of this?" she asked, dreading the answer. Michael looked at her with sadness, knowing his words would hurt her. "You're part of his plan, Jessica. He chose you specifically for a reason. Your marriage to him wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was part of a strategy. There are people from Richard's past, enemies who once betrayed him, and you, unknowingly, are connected to one of those people." Jessica felt the world crumble around her. Her hands trembled slightly as she processed what Michael had just said. How could she be connected to Richard's enemies? Everything she had believed about her marriage, about her life, was starting to fall apart. "Who?" she asked in a barely audible voice. "Who in my life is connected to him?" Michael took a step closer, his expression filled with regret. "Your father, Jessica. Richard and he were involved in business dealings that didn't end well. Your father was part of a group that betrayed Richard years ago, and ever since he's been seeking revenge. And you were the perfect way to draw those ghosts from the past." The pain Jessica felt in that moment was overwhelming. Her father. She had always believed her father, a humble man who had worked hard to support his family, had nothing to do with the intrigues of power, and now she was discovering that she had been used as a tool in Richard's revenge. Tears threatened to escape her eyes, but Jessica held them back. She couldn't allow herself to appear weak in that moment. She needed to be strong, even though everything inside her was crumbling. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you know this from the beginning? Were you part of this game too?" Michael quickly shook his head, taking another step toward her. "No, Jessica. At first I didn't know what Richard was planning. All I knew was that he was frustrated with his past and the people who had betrayed him, but I never imagined you were involved. Until it was too late." Jessica looked at him, trying to read his face, searching for signs of lies or manipulation, but she found only sincerity. However, that didn't ease her pain. Michael, even unintentionally, had also been part of Richard's manipulation. "I want to help you," he said, his tone desperate. "I don't want you to keep being part of this. I want to get you out of here, but you have to trust me." Michael's words echoed in her head, but Jessica didn't know whom to trust anymore. She felt like she was alone in this cruel game, manipulated by everyone around her. Richard had built a web in which she was just another piece, and even though Michael claimed to want to protect her, he was still part of the board. "I don't know if I can trust you, Michael," Jessica confessed, with a sadness weighing heavily on her chest. "I don't know if I can trust anyone now." Michael lowered his gaze, accepting the weight of his guilt. He knew there was nothing he could say to ease Jessica's pain. She had been betrayed in the worst possible way, and he had been part of that, even unintentionally. The silence between them was interrupted by a soft knock on the door of the hall. Both turned quickly, and Jessica's heart skipped a beat when she saw Richard standing in the doorway, watching them in silence. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Richard had heard enough. What she didn't know was how he was going to react. The hours that followed Jessica's discovery were an emotional storm. Her mind kept replaying Michael's words, revealing that her marriage to Richard was part of a dark revenge plan. The connection between her father and Richard, the manipulation she had been subjected to, and the implicit betrayal in every gesture and look from the two men surrounding her, left her devastated. After Richard's unsettling appearance in the hall, Michael had left in silence, not wanting to provoke more tension. Richard, for his part, had acted as if he hadn't heard anything, showing his usual unshakable calm. But Jessica knew everything was changing, that Richard's chess pieces were moving, and somehow she was still one of them. That night, Jessica found herself walking alone through the mansion's corridors, unable to sleep. She felt the weight of everything she had discovered, and above all, the guilt that was beginning to grow inside her. Despite what she now knew, she couldn't ignore her feelings for Michael. He had also been part of the deception, but she felt his intentions were sincere. That didn't stop a shadow of doubt from enveloping every thought she had about him. She entered the library, the only place where she could be alone with her thoughts. The shelves full of books, the soft scent of old paper, and the silence of the night created a temporary refuge, but they couldn't quiet the emotional chaos tormenting her. She sat in an armchair, hugging herself as if seeking protection. "Are you all right?" Richard's voice broke her reverie. He was standing at the door with his usual neutral expression, but Jessica knew nothing he did or said was casual. Richard always had a hidden motive, a plan he followed regardless of the circumstances. "I can't sleep," Jessica replied, trying to sound calmer than she felt. Richard walked towards her and sat in the armchair across from hers, studying her in silence before speaking. "What I told you the other night. I wanted you to know that I'm willing to give you what you need, Jessica," he said with a softness that she found more unsettling than comforting. "I don't want you to feel trapped. If Michael makes you feel alive, I have no problem with that. What matters most is that we keep up appearances. Our marriage is more than just an emotional bond. It's an alliance." Jessica looked at him in silence, trying to unravel his true intentions. Every word Richard said was loaded with double meanings, and now, more than ever, she understood that he had always held the upper hand. But what disturbed her the most was her own reaction to what Richard was telling her. She was supposed to feel relieved at the thought of being able to see Michael without fear of consequences, but instead, all she felt was deep remorse. "How can you say that so easily?" she murmured, unable to contain herself. "Don't you care about anything other than maintaining control?" Richard smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "What I care about is preserving what I've built, Jessica. We're not children playing with emotions. What we do here has consequences beyond our personal lives. But if you feel guilty about being close to Michael, maybe you should ask yourself what you're truly looking for." His words froze her. Richard wasn't just manipulating the situation. He was encouraging her to continue her relationship with Michael, as if it was all part of his plan. Jessica clenched her fists in her lap, feeling the weight of a decision she had never wanted to make. Could she continue to allow Richard to control her, knowing what she now knew? "I'm not going to play your game," she said, with a tone firmer than she expected. Richard stared at her as if analyzing every word she said. Then, without another comment, he stood up. "The choice is yours, Jessica, but don't forget that every step you take has consequences," he warned before walking out. When the library door closed, Jessica felt her body finally relax. But her mind was still in turmoil. What had become of her? She was being pulled into the schemes of a man who saw her as a mere tool, and the hardest thing to accept was that her feelings for Michael, in the midst of all this chaos, were genuine. Hours later, as the shadows of the night stretched longer, Jessica wandered into the mansion's gardens, trying to clear her mind. The cool night air caressed her skin, but the knot of guilt in her chest refused to loosen. Walking through the flower-lined paths, she found Michael. He seemed as restless as she was. Upon seeing her, he approached quickly, but kept a cautious distance. "Jessica, I don't want you to feel this way," he said, reading the pain on her face. "What's happening between us isn't a mistake. You shouldn't blame yourself for it." Jessica looked at him, tears threatening to fill her eyes. She knew her feelings for him weren't just a fleeting attraction, but the circumstances made her doubt everything. "You don't understand, Michael. I feel like I'm being swept up in something I can't control. And while my feelings for you are real, I can't ignore the guilt that's consuming me." Michael lowered his gaze, clearly sharing Jessica's frustration. He knew that everything happening was the result of Richard's manipulations and that they were both trapped in a dangerous game. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. "You're not the only one who feels trapped," he murmured. "My life has been under Richard's control for years. Everything I do, every decision I make always seems to be guided by his shadow. But what I feel for you, that's the one thing that's mine, Jessica. The one thing he can't control." His words resonated with her, but the remorse remained, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Despite everything, she felt like she was betraying not just Richard, but herself. She had entered this marriage out of spite, but she had never imagined her life would become entangled in a web of secrets, lies, and manipulation. "I don't know if I can keep going like this," she finally confessed. "I feel like I'm losing control of my life and I don't know how to stop it." Michael took a step closer to her, but this time he didn't touch her. Instead, he looked at her with the same intensity she had felt from the first time they met. "You don't have to decide now, Jessica. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I won't let Richard destroy you. We're not alone in this." Jessica nodded slightly, but doubt still haunted her. Michael was sincere, she knew that, but there was something much bigger at stake, something beyond the two of them. Richard wouldn't let his plan fall apart so easily, and the shadow of what was to come continued to torment her. The night grew darker, but the path Jessica had to take was still unclear. The guilt over her feelings for Michael consumed her, but deep down, she knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep living under the control of a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. However, as Michael walked away, leaving her alone under the stars, Jessica wondered if she would ever be able to escape the trap that had been set for her. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was heavier than usual. Jessica sat in the dining room, watching as Richard coldly reviewed some papers while sipping his coffee. Since their conversation the previous night, something inside her had shifted. She knew she could no longer be a puppet in her husband's game, but she still didn't know how to escape the web he had woven. As she observed Richard, unease grew within her. There was something strange about his behavior that morning. Though he had always been methodical and calculating, today he seemed even more focused on his affairs, almost as if he were anticipating the next move in his plan. Jessica began to wonder what else he was hiding, and if everything that had happened so far was just a small part of something much bigger. "Would you like to go out this afternoon?" Richard asked suddenly, without looking up from his documents. Jessica looked at him, surprised. Richard rarely suggested anything unrelated to his business or maintaining appearances at social events. "Go out? Where?" she responded cautiously. Richard smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I thought we could visit one of the family's vineyards. It's a quiet place, perfect for clearing your mind." His tone was casual, almost relaxed, but Jessica couldn't help but notice an undercurrent of tension in his proposal. Something about that invitation didn't sit right with her. Throughout their marriage, Richard had maintained a considerable emotional distance, interested only in his own plans. Now suddenly he was showing unexpected kindness, right after having encouraged her to continue her relationship with Michael. It was as if he were trying to distract her, to pull her away from the center of his devious game. Jessica, more cautious than ever, decided to play along, but with growing suspicion that Richard had more up his sleeve than he was letting on. "All right," Jessica replied, forcing a smile. "It might be a good idea." The afternoon arrived, and as the car took them out of the city, the silence between them was deafening. Richard gazed out the window, seemingly lost in his own thoughts, while Jessica couldn't stop wondering what the real motive behind this unexpected outing was. The tension in her chest increased with every mile they traveled. They finally arrived at the vineyard, a vast landscape of grapevines stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a beautiful place, but to Jessica, it represented a disturbing pause in a power struggle she didn't fully understand. As they walked through the grounds, Richard began to speak, but what he said wasn't what Jessica had expected. "Many years ago, before I met your father, this vineyard was my refuge." He started with a tone more personal than usual. "This is where I would come when business or others' betrayals suffocated me. Here I could think clearly." Jessica listened silently, puzzled by the turn in the conversation. Richard rarely talked about his past, let alone anything personal. "It was in this place that I made the most important decisions of my life." Richard continued, his gaze fixed on the vines swaying gently in the wind. "Decisions that led me to become who I am today. And in the end, those decisions led me to you." Jessica looked at him, her heart racing. She knew Richard didn't make confessions without a reason. What he was revealing now had a purpose, and it probably wasn't for her to understand him better. He was setting something up. "When your father and I crossed paths, I realized that not all men are trustworthy," Richard said, his tone now colder. "Some seek to destroy what others build, no matter the cost. Your father was one of those men." Jessica felt a lump in her throat. The connection between her father and Richard, something she had only recently learned about, was now being revealed as a dark chapter in her family's history. But what hurt the most was the coldness with which Richard spoke about it all, as if people were mere pieces in his game. "He betrayed me," Richard continued, his gaze still on the horizon. "And I knew that one day I would have to settle the score. When I met you, Jessica, I saw the perfect opportunity to do so." The frankness in his voice sent chills down Jessica's spine. Now there was no doubt. Her marriage had been part of a revenge plan from the start. Richard had deliberately chosen her, not out of love, not out of interest, but as part of a reckoning with the past. "So that's it," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "You married me just to get revenge for something that happened years ago? To punish my family?" Richard turned to her with a calculating smile. "Jessica, not everything is black and white. Yes, marrying you was a way to make sure your father paid for what he did. But I also did it because I knew it was best for both of us. With you by my side, my revenge carries more weight, more meaning." Jessica took a step back, overwhelmed by what she was hearing. Richard's manipulation was far deeper than she had imagined. Her entire life, from the moment she met him, had been a lie. "And Michael?" Jessica asked, her voice shaking. "Are you using him in your plan too?" Richard raised an eyebrow as if the question seemed naive to him. "Michael has his own role in all of this, but his involvement wasn't intentional. In fact, his attraction to you was an unexpected advantage." Jessica's stomach churned. Everything she had experienced, all the emotions, the feelings for Michael, had been part of a plan that Richard had orchestrated from the beginning. Her life was a cage, and there was no escape. "Why are you telling me all this now?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her composure. "Because it no longer matters whether you know or not," Richard replied, his tone colder than ever. "The pieces are in place. I just wanted you to understand that there's nothing you can do to change it." Jessica looked at him, feeling desperation rising inside her. Richard had planned everything, and now he was showing her his power without any remorse. The vineyard, the conversation, everything had been part of a carefully calculated moment to reveal the magnitude of his manipulation. But as Richard continued to speak, something inside Jessica shifted. She was no longer the woman who had entered this marriage out of spite. Now she understood the true face of Richard, and she knew she couldn't remain a passive victim. She would have to find a way to fight back, though she didn't know how. As the sun set behind the hills, Jessica realized that she was alone in her battle, but she also knew that somehow she had to find the strength to bring down Richard's game. Night had fallen when Jessica and Richard returned to the mansion. Though they hadn't exchanged words during the ride, the silence between them was more telling than any conversation. Jessica, still processing the revelations Richard had made, knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep living under the control of a man who saw her as a tool in his revenge. But the question kept echoing in her mind. How could she escape someone like Richard, who always seemed to be one step ahead? When they arrived, Richard quickly retreated to his study, leaving her alone in the grand hall. The mansion was dark and quiet, as if the very walls knew that something was about to crumble. Jessica knew she couldn't keep all of this inside anymore. She needed answers, and though her feelings for Michael were full of contradictions, he was the only person she could talk to honestly. She hurried up the stairs, searching for the wing of the house where Michael usually spent his nights. When she reached his room, she hesitated for a moment at the door, her heart pounding. Uncertainty and fear battled within her, but so did a growing determination. Finally, she knocked softly. "Come in," came Michael's deep voice from the other side. Jessica entered and found him sitting by the window, his gaze lost in the dark night. The dim light from the lamp illuminated his face, showing an expression of weariness and concern. Seeing her, Michael quickly stood, surprised by her presence. "Jessica, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of concern, as he noticed the troubled look on her face. "I need to know the truth," she said bluntly, stepping toward him. "I can't keep going like this. Richard has revealed part of his plan, but I feel like there's still so much I don't understand. And you, Michael, I don't know who to trust." Michael frowned, visibly affected by Jessica's words. He knew the moment of truth had arrived, and although he had tried to protect her from the worst, he could no longer keep hiding the reality. "Jessica," he began, his voice heavy, "what Richard is doing is much darker than you imagine. I never wanted you to be dragged into this." Jessica stepped closer, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "What do you mean, Michael? What role do you play in all of this? Because ever since I met you, everything has been a whirlwind of emotions and secrets. I want to know if you're playing me too." Michael looked at her deeply, feeling the weight of his own guilt. He walked toward her but stopped just before touching her, aware of the barrier that now separated them. "I'm not playing you, Jessica," he said, his voice breaking. "My feelings for you are real, they have been from the beginning, but it's true that I'm caught in Richard's damn game." Jessica watched him, trying to discern if she could believe his words. The Michael standing before her wasn't the cold man she had initially imagined. There was something in his vulnerability that disarmed her, but she wasn't ready to lower her defenses yet. "Richard has been using me," Michael continued. "At first I thought he just wanted to maintain control over the family business, but soon I realized his intentions went beyond that. It's all about revenge for what your father did. Richard has had me under his control for years, forcing me to follow his orders." Jessica felt a lump in her throat, her heart pounding as she heard what she had feared all along. "What kind of control?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael lowered his gaze, his face hardened by the weight of the truth. "My mother, Richard has her under his power. She's the reason I agreed to be part of his game in the first place. I knew that if I didn't, he would destroy her. She's sick and needs constant care. Richard has the resources and the means to take care of her, but in exchange, he's forced me to stay by his side and carry out his plans." Jessica stepped back, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Richard's manipulation. Now she understood why Michael always seemed trapped, why his eyes carried so much suffering. He had been forced to follow his uncle's lead to protect his mother. "Michael," Jessica began, her voice trembling with compassion, "I didn't know." "I'm not asking you to understand," Michael interrupted, bitterness in his voice. "But now you know. Richard has been using me to stay close to you, to make me another pawn in his revenge game. He thought that if I got close to you, it would make everything easier to control, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I fell in love with you, Jessica, and that wasn't part of the plan." Michael's last words made the air in the room freeze. Jessica looked at him, her emotions overflowing. She felt the weight of her love for Michael, but also the pain of betrayal, knowing that everything had started as part of a cruel game. "What do we do now?" she asked, a mix of desperation and hope in her voice. "Richard won't stop. He has trapped both of us." Michael looked at her with a determination she hadn't seen before. "It doesn't have to be this way," he said, stepping closer to her. "We can't keep playing by his rules. We need to find a way out of this game before it's too late, and I'm not going to let him destroy you." Jessica felt a glimmer of hope in Michael's words, but she knew things wouldn't be that simple. Richard was relentless, and escaping his control wouldn't be easy. "How?" Jessica's voice trembled. "How do we get out of this?" Michael stepped closer, finally taking her hands in his. His eyes reflected a mix of sadness and resolve. "First, we need information. We have to understand all of Richard's moves before we do anything. He has a lot of connections, but he also has weaknesses. I know some people who might help us dig up what he's really planning, but the most important thing is, we can't let Richard know we're working together." Jessica nodded slowly. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the idea of having a way out, of fighting against Richard's control, gave her a spark of hope. "We're in this together, Michael," she said, feeling her own words give her strength. "I won't let Richard keep manipulating us." Michael nodded, and though both knew the road ahead was fraught with danger, at that moment, they shared a feeling of unity. For the first time since everything began, Jessica felt like she had someone by her side willing to fight for her, someone ready to risk everything. But the danger wasn't just in what Richard might do. Jessica and Michael both knew that revenge, once set in motion, was a train that couldn't be easily stopped, and now both of them were on that train, waiting for the inevitable crash. The days following her conversation with Michael were a mix of uncertainty and planning. With renewed determination, Jessica began to watch Richard's every move more closely, searching for patterns, signs of weakness in his apparent control. The idea of escaping his influence was still distant, but she no longer felt so powerless. Now she had Michael on her side, and that gave her a flicker of hope in the darkness surrounding her. That morning, sitting in the dining room, Jessica gazed through the large window overlooking the garden. The sun's rays filtering through the curtains reminded her that, even though her life seemed cloaked in shadows, the world outside kept turning. She knew Richard was in an important meeting with some associates, and that for a few hours the mansion would be free of his presence. It was the perfect moment to move forward with their plan. Michael had mentioned some people who could help them obtain valuable information about Richard's business dealings and contacts. There was a group of associates who, despite owing Richard loyalty, had their own hidden agendas. But before taking action, they needed evidence, something they could use to destabilize him from within. Jessica stood up, her mind focused on an idea that had been circling in her head for days: Richard's private documents. She knew he kept confidential files in his office, contracts and agreements with people of questionable reputation. If she could access them, she might find something compromising enough to challenge her husband's empire. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Richard's office was a fortress, always locked and protected by his confidence that no one would dare cross his boundaries. But Jessica was no longer the fearful woman she had been when she married him. Richard's betrayal, the discovery of his vengeance, and the pain of being used had transformed her. She was willing to risk everything for her freedom. She approached the office, making sure the staff wasn't nearby. She had once seen the key, tucked away in a drawer in the living room. She knew Richard wouldn't expect her to attempt something like this, which gave her an advantage. She found the key in the same place and, with her heart racing, headed for the office. When the door opened, Jessica felt a shiver run down her spine. Richard's office was impeccably organized, with dark furniture and an enormous bookshelf filled with books he likely never read. At the center, the large mahogany desk, the witness of countless transactions, was the target of her search. She closed the door behind her and approached the desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to stay calm. She knew she had to be quick but meticulous. Any mistake could expose her. She started going through the drawers one by one, looking for something she could use against him. Papers, contracts, transfer files. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but Jessica knew Richard's true darkness was hidden among those documents. When she opened the last drawer, she found a folder thicker than the others. As she pulled it out, she noticed a name written on the cover: Rodriguez, her father's last name. The knot in her stomach tightened even more. She knew she was about to uncover something that could change everything. Slowly, she opened the folder and began to read. What she found inside was far more than she expected. They were documents detailing an old partnership between Richard and her father. But what surprised her the most was that, according to the papers, her father had tried to distance himself from Richard and the shady dealings they were involved in. Jessica had always thought her father was guilty of betraying Richard, but what these documents suggested was the opposite. It had been Richard who had deceived her father, manipulating the situation to take a large part of his fortune. Jessica felt anger and pain mix inside her. Her father had been another victim of Richard's schemes, just like she was. And now, she had in her hands the proof that could destroy him. "What are you doing in here?" Richard's cold voice echoed from the doorway. Jessica turned abruptly, her heart in her throat. Richard stood in the doorway, watching her with a mix of surprise and fury. It was clear he hadn't expected to find her rummaging through his office. "Jessica," his voice was low but full of warning, "close that folder and put it back where it belongs." Jessica looked at him, feeling the weight of her decision in every part of her body. She knew this was the moment. Either she backed down and remained the woman controlled by him, or she stood her ground with the strength she had accumulated and faced whatever came. "Not anymore," Jessica said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "I can't keep pretending, Richard. I know what you did, not just to my father, but to me, and I won't let you keep manipulating me." Richard took a step toward her, his face hardening. "You don't understand what you're getting into," he warned. "What you're doing is dangerous. You know you can't win this game, Jessica." But Jessica didn't back down. For the first time since everything began, she felt in control. Even if only for a brief moment, it was enough. "You won't know until you try," she replied, holding the folder tightly in her hands. "And now I have something that gives me an advantage." Richard looked at her, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Jessica knew he was deciding what to do, how to handle her, but she no longer cared. She was ready to face him, even if it meant risking everything. The silence between them stretched for a few tense seconds until Richard gave a cold, joyless smile. "You think this is enough to bring me down?" he said, his tone sarcastic. "But there are things you still don't understand. What you have there is only a small part of something much bigger. And if you think you can take me on with just this, you're underestimating what I'm capable of." Jessica looked at him, her heart racing, but her determination didn't waver. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but she also knew there was no turning back. This was just the beginning of her confrontation with Richard, and though she didn't have all the answers yet, she was ready to fight for her freedom. "Maybe it's not enough yet," she said calmly, "but I'm no longer alone in this." Richard's eyes narrowed, catching the message behind her words. His smile disappeared, and for a moment, Jessica thought she saw a flash of restrained fury in his gaze. But then, without saying another word, he turned and left the office, leaving her alone with the folder and the feeling that she had just lit a spark that couldn't be extinguished. The hours after the confrontation in the office passed in a blur for Jessica. She knew she had crossed a line with Richard and that things would never be the same again. The house, which had always been imposing and cold, now felt charged with constant tension, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next move in their power game. And what worried Jessica the most was that, although she had the folder with evidence, she didn't know how or when to use it. She knew facing Richard wouldn't be so simple. That night, Michael found her in the living room, sitting by the fire, lost in her thoughts. She had tried to keep her distance from him, knowing that any closeness could be interpreted by Richard as a direct challenge. But Michael, worried about the confrontation Jessica had with his uncle, couldn't stay away. "Jessica," he said softly as he approached, his voice reflecting the concern he felt. Jessica looked up, her eyes tired but determined. "Michael, he knows," she murmured, unable to stop her voice from trembling slightly. "He knows I found everything. There's no turning back now." Michael sat next to her, watching her with a mix of sadness and admiration. He knew Jessica had taken a bold step by confronting Richard, but he also understood how dangerous the situation was now. Richard was not a man who accepted losing control, and Jessica had challenged him in a way he would never allow. "Are you sure he knows everything?" Michael asked, his voice low as he quickly glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Jessica nodded, clutching the folder in her lap. "I showed him the evidence. He knows I have my father's folder. He said it wasn't enough, but he also knows I won't stop. Something changed in him, Michael. He doesn't just want control anymore. He wants to punish me for daring to defy him." Michael frowned, processing what Jessica was saying. He knew they were in dangerous territory, and though he had tried to keep Jessica safe up until this point, he also knew that Richard wouldn't play fair. "What you have is a strong blow, but it's not enough to take him down," Michael admitted. "Richard has made too many deals in the shadows, and if we face him now, we might only wound him, but not defeat him." Jessica sighed. She knew Michael was right, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency inside her. Richard had controlled her life for too long, and she couldn't stand the thought of continuing to live under his shadow. "Then what do we do?" she asked, trying to calm the frustration she felt. "Do we wait? Let him keep holding the reins?" Michael leaned forward, taking Jessica's hands in his. His dark eyes reflected a mix of determination and vulnerability. "No, we're not going to wait. The first thing we need to do is find more information. Richard has many enemies, people who also want to see him fall. If we can get some of those allies on our side, we can start isolating him little by little until he's left with no support. Then, and only then, Can we deliver the final blow? Jessica looked at him, feeling a small spark of hope. She knew Michael was right, and though she didn't want to wait any longer, she understood that a direct confrontation would be suicidal. Richard was a powerful man, and if they wanted to defeat him, they would have to be smarter than him. "And how do we find these people?" Jessica asked, her voice steadier now. Michael smiled faintly, as if he had been waiting for that question. "I've already started looking," he confessed. "Richard has made deals with many powerful men, but not all of them are on his side. Some of them have had run-ins with him in the past, and they're waiting for the right moment to act. I've spoken to one of them. He's a man who came close to losing everything because of a corrupt deal with Richard." Jessica's eyes widened. "And do you think he'd be willing to help us?" Michael nodded. "If we play our cards right, yes. What we need now is more evidence, more information we can use as leverage. If we can weaken his influence, we can attract others." Jessica knew Michael was right, but she was also aware that time wasn't on their side. Richard had already shown he wouldn't tolerate any more challenges, and the tension in the house grew with each passing day. "There's something else," Michael said, his voice dropping even lower. "Richard has a deal with someone outside the country, a connection he's kept secret. I don't know exactly who it is, but I've heard their name in a few conversations. If we can uncover that connection and use it against him, we might have the power to stop him." Jessica remained silent, taking in the information. The idea that Richard had allies beyond his local connections unsettled her, but it also gave her a direction to focus her efforts. "How do we find out who this person is?" she asked. Michael stood up, his gaze firm. "I'm going to dig deeper, but we need to be careful. Richard doesn't suspect me yet, but any false move could expose our alliance." Jessica looked into his eyes, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. She knew Michael was risking everything for her, and though her feelings for him were intense, she also feared that Richard would destroy them both if he discovered their plan. "Don't put yourself in danger for me," Jessica whispered. "If something happens to you—" Michael interrupted her, stepping closer to gently caress her face. "I won't let anything happen to you, Jessica. We've come too far to stop now." The warmth of his hand against her cheek comforted her, but it also reminded her of how fragile their circumstances were. She knew that if they wanted to succeed, they would have to move with caution and precision, but she couldn't ignore the growing fear inside her. Michael leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a gesture that was both a comfort and a silent promise. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel that connection, knowing it was the only real thing amid the chaos surrounding them. When they pulled apart, Michael gave her one last firm look before leaving the room, leaving Jessica alone with her thoughts. Michael's words echoed in her mind. "If we play our cards right, we can defeat him." And Jessica knew she couldn't let fear hold her back. Now was the time to be smarter than Richard, to seize every opportunity to dismantle his control. The fight was far from over, but Jessica was no longer the same woman who had entered this marriage. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she had something Richard could never take from her, her will to fight for her freedom. That night, before retiring to her room, Jessica took the folder with the evidence she had discovered and placed it in a safe spot. The first blow had been struck. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The atmosphere in the mansion grew tenser with each passing day. Jessica could feel the weight of every look from the servants and the unspoken questions floating in the air. Since the confrontation with Richard in his office, everything had changed. Although he had yet to take direct action against her, she knew he was preparing his next move. Richard was not a man who allowed himself to be challenged without responding, and Jessica was acutely aware that danger was lurking. Michael knew it too, but they both continued acting with the same routine, pretending everything was the same. The facade remained, at least to the outside world, but privately, Michael had intensified his investigation. He knew that if they wanted to bring Richard down, they had to uncover who this mysterious international connection was, the one who protected him and gave him power beyond the country's borders. That day, as Jessica walked through the garden, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy, Michael surprised her with news. He approached her while she watched the flowers wilt under the coming season's cold. "Jessica, I found something," he said quietly, making sure no one was nearby to overhear them. Jessica looked at him, feeling a mix of relief and fear. She knew whatever Michael was about to tell her could change everything, but it could also put them in even more danger. "What is it?" she asked, keeping calm as Michael led her to a more secluded corner of the garden. Once they were sure they were alone, Michael pulled a small envelope from inside his jacket. He handed it to Jessica, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside, there was a blurry photo of a man she didn't recognize, along with several international newspaper clippings mentioning his name. "His name is Victor Dragomir," Michael explained, his voice tense. "He's a Bulgarian businessman, but in reality he's linked to multiple illegal activities, including arms trafficking and money laundering. Richard has been working with him for years, using his network to expand his empire beyond Spain." Jessica stared at the photo and the clippings, her mind processing the gravity of what Michael had just revealed. "And why is he important to us?" she asked, still trying to understand how this man could be the key to dismantling Richard. Michael took a deep breath before responding. "Victor is one of Richard's biggest financial backers. He's provided the means to keep many of Richard's dirty businesses in the shadows. If we can expose this connection and reveal Victor's illegal activities, we could cut off Richard's strongest support." Jessica nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the scope of what Michael had uncovered. If they could link Richard to Victor and expose the latter's criminal dealings, they wouldn't just ruin Richard's reputation, they would leave him vulnerable to the law. It was a unique opportunity, but also extremely dangerous. "How do we do it?" she asked finally. "How can we expose him without Richard finding out?" Michael rubbed his chin, thinking about their next move. "Victor is planning a trip to Spain in a few weeks to meet with Richard. We have to intercept that meeting. If we can capture some evidence of their dealings, we can use it as proof to expose both of them." Jessica felt a wave of nerves wash over her. The idea of being so close to both Richard and Victor during a secret meeting terrified her, but she also knew that this might be their only chance. "It's risky," she murmured, almost to herself. "I know," Michael responded, looking her in the eyes, "but we can't stop now. If we let this chance slip away, Richard will only grow stronger." Jessica knew Michael was right. If they wanted to bring Richard down, they had to seize every opportunity, even if it meant putting their lives on the line. There was no other option. "Do you know when and where the meeting will take place?" she asked, now more determined. Michael nodded. "It will be in a private villa on the outskirts of the city. One of my contacts informed me that Victor will arrive in secret and that the meeting with Richard will be behind closed doors, but security will be tight. Getting in undetected will be difficult." Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were stepping into a much more dangerous game than she had imagined at first, but there was no turning back now. "We'll do it," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. Michael looked at her, surprised by the determination in her words. He knew Jessica was taking a great risk, but he also understood that they had come too far to stop. "We'll do it," Michael repeated, taking her hand gently, a silent promise that they were in this together until the end. In the following days, Michael began preparing the plan to intercept the meeting between Richard and Victor. They knew it would be difficult, but they had a few allies in the shadows, people disillusioned with Richard who would be willing to help them if the circumstances were right. Meanwhile, Jessica tried to maintain her facade of normalcy at the mansion, even though the tension was growing. Richard barely spoke to her, but whenever he did, his words were laced with veiled threats. He knew she was planning something, ready to crush her if she dared to challenge him again. One night while Jessica was in her room, reviewing her father's documents, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, only to find Richard standing in the doorway, his face hidden in the shadows. "You've been quite busy lately," Richard said softly but with a threatening undertone. Jessica tried to stay calm, slowly closing the folder and placing it on the table. "Just going over some family papers," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Richard stepped forward, his imposing presence filling the room. "You know, Jessica, I've noticed that you've been taking too many liberties lately," he murmured. "Liberties that could cost you dearly if you're not careful." Jessica's heart was pounding, but she didn't allow fear to paralyze her. She knew Richard was playing a game, trying to intimidate her, but she was no longer the fearful woman she had once been. "You're the one who has played with my life, Richard," she replied, her voice firm. "And I know you think you still have control over me, but you don't. Now I have something that could destroy you, and you know it." Richard stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Jessica alone with the realization that the war between them was about to escalate to an entirely new level. Jessica knew the final confrontation with Richard was near, and while the fear remained, she also felt a growing strength inside her. She had Michael by her side, and together, they were ready to bring Richard down and dismantle his corrupt empire, even if it meant facing Victor and all the danger that came with him. The villa on the outskirts of the city was surrounded by silence and mystery. Though from the outside it appeared ordinary, Michael had done enough research to know that this was where Richard and Victor would meet in secret. Jessica watched the house from a distance, standing next to Michael, both of them hidden among the dense vegetation. The tension between them was palpable, but so was their determination. "That's it," Michael whispered, nodding towards the villa. Jessica nodded. From a distance, there didn't seem to be much movement, but they knew appearances were deceiving. The villa's security was rigorous, with guards watching every entrance. Getting in undetected would be a challenge, but they had no other option. This meeting between Richard and Victor was their chance to gather the evidence that could finally bring Richard down. "Are we sure Victor is already inside?" Jessica asked, keeping her eyes on the villa. Michael checked his watch, his face a mixture of nerves and confidence. "My contact said he arrived this morning. Everything should be set. We just need to wait for the meeting to start, and then we go in." Jessica swallowed hard. She knew what was at stake. One mistake, one wrong move, and everything would fall apart. Richard wouldn't forgive them if they were caught, and Victor wasn't the type of man to leave loose ends. They were stepping into dangerous territory, but there was no stopping now. "How do you plan to get in?" she asked. Michael gave her a nervous smile. "I've made some friends in security," he replied, as he pulled out a small magnetic card from his pocket. "One of them owes me a favor and got me access to the back entrance. We'll use this card to get into the surveillance system. If we can disable the cameras for a brief moment, we'll have a chance to slip in without anyone noticing." Jessica looked at the card in Michael's hands, feeling her heart race. Everything depended on this plan working. If they failed to disable the cameras, they would be discovered instantly. "All right," Jessica said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it." As the sun began to set on the horizon, they finally made their move. Michael, moving with calculated precision, led them along the edge of the property, staying away from the security patrols. Jessica followed closely, every step carefully placed to avoid making noise. When they finally reached a small back door, Michael pulled out the card and slid it through the reader. After a few seconds of silence, there was a soft click and the door opened. "Let's go," Michael whispered, entering first and making sure the hallway was clear. Jessica followed, quietly closing the door behind her. The villa, though luxurious, had a cold and calculated atmosphere, just like everything surrounding Richard. She knew the guards were busy watching the main entrances and external areas, giving them a small window to move undetected. Michael quickly led them to a small control room, equipped with monitors showing the villa's security cameras. He slid the card again and began typing into the system. Jessica watched from the door, keeping an eye on the hallway in case anyone approached. "Done," Michael murmured after a few minutes. I've disabled the cameras in the East Wing, where the meeting will take place. We have about 5 minutes before they realize something's wrong. Jessica nodded, feeling the adrenaline surge through her veins. 5 minutes wasn't much time, but it was all they needed. They left the control room and headed for the East Wing, moving quickly through the empty halls. As they neared the meeting room, Jessica could hear muffled voices behind the door. They stopped right in front of the door, and Michael leaned toward her. "Listen first," he whispered. "We want proof of their dealings. We can't risk barging in without knowing what they're discussing." Jessica nodded and leaned against the door, straining to hear. The voices inside were low, but she recognized Richard's unmistakable voice, cold and calculating. Then she heard a deeper, more menacing voice, likely Victor's. They seemed to be discussing the details of an important transaction, something related to an arms smuggling network that spanned multiple countries. Every word coming from their mouths was more incriminating than the last. "Do you have it?" Michael asked, looking at Jessica expectantly. Jessica nodded, her heart racing. She pulled out her phone and began recording in silence. She knew they couldn't stay long, but they needed to capture enough information to incriminate both Richard and Victor. As they continued recording, Jessica heard Richard mention a major shipment arriving in the coming weeks. Victor responded with a cold laugh, assuring him that everything was under control. The conversation was exactly what they needed, clear proof that both men were involved in illegal activities that crossed borders. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed behind them. Jessica and Michael turned quickly, their hearts stopping when they saw a security guard standing a few feet away. His expression of surprise quickly turned to suspicion, and before he could react, Michael lunged at him, pinning him against the wall. "Go!" Michael told Jessica urgently. "Finish recording and get out of here." Jessica hesitated for a second, but she knew there wasn't time. Michael could handle the guard, but if they were discovered, the whole plan would fall apart. She ran to the door, finishing the recording, capturing Victor's last words, before the guard recovered and began shouting for help. The sound of alarms filled the villa instantly. Jessica, with the phone in hand, rushed back down the hallway they had come from, hearing the fast footsteps of more guards approaching. She knew Michael would follow when he could, but for now her only option was to escape with the evidence they had gathered. When she finally made it out of the villa and reached the safe spot Michael had prepared outside the property, Jessica stopped, breathing heavily. Her heart was still racing, but inside, she felt a mix of terror and relief. They had gotten the evidence they needed, but the trap had been too close to snapping shut on them. Minutes later, Michael appeared, shaken but unharmed. He had managed to deal with the guard before being caught, and now he was beside her, watching the villa from a distance as the alarms continued to blare. "We did it," Michael said, breathing deeply. Jessica nodded, still trying to calm herself. "We have what we need," she murmured, showing the phone. But both of them knew the real challenge still lay ahead. They had the evidence, but now they had to use it to destroy Richard and Victor before they destroyed them. The mansion, which had always been a place of coldness and control, now felt like a trap. Jessica and Michael had managed to escape Victor's villa unscathed and had the evidence they needed to expose Richard. However, now that the alarms had been triggered, they knew Richard's reaction would be swift and ruthless. The cards were on the table, and any mistake could cost them everything. Jessica, sitting in the mansion's living room, couldn't stop staring at her phone, where the recording that would change everything was stored. The evidence was there. Richard's connection to Victor, the illegal transactions, the names and dates that could bring both men down. It was enough to destroy Richard's reputation and strip him of his power. But she still didn't know what their next step should be. Michael entered the room, his face showing signs of concern. Although they had managed to escape the villa, the danger still loomed. Now they had to act smarter than ever. "We don't have much time," Michael said, sitting next to Jessica. "Richard knows someone was there. Sooner or later, he'll figure out it was us." Jessica nodded. The weight of the situation was crushing, but there was no turning back. They had to find a way to expose the truth before Richard acted against them. "What do we do now?" Jessica asked, her voice tense. "We have the evidence, but if Richard finds out we have it, he won't hesitate to destroy us." Michael looked at the recording on Jessica's phone, knowing it was their only advantage right now. "We can't go directly to the police," Michael murmured. "Richard has too many connections in law enforcement. If we do, we risk them erasing all the evidence before we can act." Jessica bit her lip, thinking they had to be smarter than Richard, but they didn't know who they could trust without exposing themselves. "We need allies," Jessica said finally. "People who want to see Richard fall but who also have the power to make it happen." Michael nodded slowly. "I know some businessmen and politicians who have had run-ins with Richard in the past. If we convince them that we have enough evidence to bring him down, they might be willing to help us. But we have to be careful. Not everyone is willing to risk going up against someone like him." Jessica looked at Michael, feeling the window of opportunity closing fast. "How long do we have before Richard figures out what we did?" she asked. "Not long," Michael admitted. "If he hasn't already started suspecting, he will soon. But before he does, we need to make sure this evidence gets into the right hands." In the days that followed, Michael and Jessica began moving with calculated precision. They used discreet contacts to reach out to those they knew might have an interest in bringing Richard down. Every meeting was conducted with utmost caution, avoiding any moves that might raise suspicion. One of the first to show interest was an ex-partner of Richard, a businessman named William Aguilar, who had been betrayed by Richard years earlier. William had lost a significant portion of his fortune due to a bad deal orchestrated by Richard, and since then, he had been looking for a way to get revenge. "If what you're saying is true," William said during one of their clandestine meetings with Michael and Jessica, "this could be the blow we've all been waiting for." Jessica showed William a portion of the recording, and he watched the video intently. His expression quickly changed from interest to a mixture of satisfaction and rage. "This is the proof we need," he said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Richard has been hiding behind his facade of being an upstanding businessman for far too long. If we can expose this to the public, there's no way he'll recover." "Do you have contacts in the media?" Jessica asked, feeling the plan beginning to take shape. "I have friends who would be more than happy to make Richard pay," William responded with a cold smile. "I can make sure this information gets to the right people. Once it goes public, Richard will be finished." Jessica felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. She knew the plan was coming together, but she was also aware that there were still many obstacles ahead. "How much time do we need?" Michael asked. William rubbed his chin, thinking, "Not long. If you give me the recording, I can leak it to the press in a matter of days. But once that happens, Richard will know it was you. There will be no turning back." Jessica nodded, knowing William was right. The moment the evidence was exposed, there would be no way to protect themselves. Richard would come after them with all his power, and they had to be ready to face him. "We're ready," Jessica said, looking at Michael. "We can't keep living under his shadow. If this is our only chance, we must take it." The days passed in a constant state of alert. Every call, every move, every conversation was meticulously planned. They knew Richard was beginning to suspect something, but they also knew he didn't have proof yet. It was only a matter of time before he figured out what they were doing. One night, while Jessica was reviewing some of her father's documents, Michael entered the room with a serious expression. "I just spoke with William," he said quietly. "The leak is already in progress. By tomorrow morning, all the media will have access to the evidence." Jessica looked at him, feeling a mix of relief and fear. "So, it's official?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Michael nodded. "Tomorrow will be the beginning of the end for Richard." Jessica felt the weight of the past weeks crashing down on her. They had come so far, and now they were about to deliver the final blow. But she also knew that, although they were attacking Richard, it wouldn't be an easy battle. Richard wouldn't stand idly by, and the reaction could be brutal. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice calmer but full of uncertainty. Michael sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "Now we wait," he replied, "but we also prepare for what's to come. Richard isn't going to let this go. You know what he'll do." Jessica nodded. She knew the danger ahead was enormous, but she also knew she was no longer alone. Michael was by her side, and though the storm that was coming might destroy everything, they were ready to face it together. "No matter what happens," Jessica said firmly, "we're ready to face him." That night, as the hours slowly passed, Jessica knew the next day would be the point of no return. The truth would come out and Richard's world would start to crumble. But she also knew that would put them directly in the line of fire. The dawn arrived with a deceptive calm. Jessica woke before sunrise, unable to sleep due to the tension building in her body. Michael was already up, standing by the window, watching the horizon with a mixture of concern and determination. They both knew that within hours, Richard's world would begin to fall apart. "Today's the day," Jessica murmured, sitting up on the bed and hugging her legs. Michael turned to her, his face somber. "Yes," he replied, "today is the beginning of the end." There was an eerie quiet in the mansion that morning. The servants went about their routine tasks, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Jessica and Michael barely spoke as they had breakfast, both lost in their thoughts, aware that each passing minute brought them closer to the crucial moment. At 9 o'clock, Jessica began to feel the first wave of panic. The plan was in motion. William had ensured the evidence reached the media, and it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. Despite the strategy, uncertainty remained. At 10 o'clock, Michael received a call that changed the atmosphere. "It's done," William said on the other end of the line. "The media has everything. In minutes, the news will be everywhere." Michael hung up, looking at Jessica with a mixture of relief and tension. "It's official," he said quietly. "Richard can't hide anymore." Jessica nodded, knowing the next few hours would be critical. As the news began to spread, the phones in the mansion started ringing. Local and international news outlets wasted no time publishing headlines, exposing the corruption, smuggling, and illegal transactions involving Richard and Victor. Within hours, the evidence circulated across the country. Business scandal. Evidence reveals connection between Richard Perez and international mafia. Elite businessman linked to arms trafficking and money laundering. The headlines couldn't have been clearer. Richard's pristine public image was crumbling before the eyes of the world. As Jessica and Michael followed the news from the safety of their room, they knew Richard's reaction wouldn't take long. It was around noon when the first shouts echoed through the mansion. Richard, furious and out of control, had received the news. His roar of anger was heard in every corner of the house. "Jessica!" Richard shouted, his voice filled with fury as he stormed through the halls. "Where are you?" Jessica and Michael exchanged a silent glance, knowing the moment had come. She took a deep breath, feeling the air heavier than ever. She had been anticipating this confrontation for weeks, but now that it was about to happen, fear mixed with determination. "I'm going to face him," Jessica said, standing up. Michael rose with her, his face tense. "Don't do it alone," he said. "You know Richard won't stop at anything." Jessica looked at him calmly, knowing he was right but also feeling that this was her moment. She had to face Richard head-on, end everything he had done, and take control of her life. "I won't," she replied, "but I have to be the one to face him. It all started because of me." Michael nodded slowly, understanding. They both knew they were stepping into the most dangerous part of the story, but they also knew there was no turning back. When Jessica stepped out of the room, Richard's footsteps echoed down the hallway, quickly approaching. Finally, she saw him at the end of the corridor, his face contorted with fury. Richard's eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now filled with uncontrolled rage. "You," Richard spat, striding towards her with clenched fists. "It was you. You leaked it." Jessica didn't back down. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on Richard's, refusing to let fear paralyze her. "Yes?" she said calmly. "It was me." Richard's face twisted into a mask of hatred. He stopped in front of Jessica, breathing heavily, as if trying to control the storm raging inside him. "You've destroyed everything," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "You've destroyed what I built, what belongs to me." Jessica held his gaze, not letting his words affect her. She knew that what Richard had built was based on lies, betrayals, and corruption, and that what was happening was the result of his own actions. "You had no right to any of it," Jessica replied firmly. "What you built was at the expense of my family and many other innocent people. And now, everything you've done is coming to light." Richard took another step toward her, his fury growing. "You're a fool if you think this is over," he said through gritted teeth. "I still have power. I can still destroy you." But Jessica didn't flinch. "No," she said calmly. "This is your end, Richard. The world knows who you are now, and even if you try to hold on to power, you have nothing left. I've won." Richard's smile was bitter, a sneer of disbelief and contempt. But before he could say more, Michael appeared behind Jessica, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You can't threaten her anymore, Richard," Michael said, his voice full of resolve. "It's over." Richard looked at both of them, his dark eyes filled with hatred and desperation. He knew Michael's words were true, but he wasn't willing to accept it. In one last attempt to regain control, he lunged towards Jessica, his body full of rage. But before he could take another step, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Richard froze, his face showing a mix of surprise and fear. "It's the police," Jessica said, looking at Richard. "They're here for you." Richard's face went pale. He knew his time had come to an end. The facade he had built for so many years was crumbling before him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the sirens grew closer, Jessica felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She had defeated Richard, but the price had been high. She knew the man who had once controlled her life was now finished, but she also understood that from this moment on, she would have to rebuild her life from the ashes of what had been. When the officers entered the mansion, Richard was arrested without resistance. His eyes, once filled with fury, were now empty, as if he had already accepted his fate. Jessica watched in silence as they took him away. Michael, by her side, gently took her hand, reminding her that even though the battle had been hard, she wasn't alone. "We did it," Michael whispered, his voice filled with relief. Jessica nodded, feeling for the first time in a long while that she could breathe freely. "Yes," she said softly, "we did it." But as she watched Richard being taken away, Jessica knew that while the storm had passed, the path to rebuilding her life was just beginning. The echo of the sirens still hung in the air when Jessica collapsed onto the couch in the living room, her body finally succumbing to the mix of relief and exhaustion. Richard had been arrested, his power destroyed, and the evidence against him was all over the news. However, despite the victory, Jessica felt as though a heavy shadow still hung over her. She had fought so hard to get to this point, but the void left after the storm left her feeling disoriented. Michael, who had been silently watching as everything unfolded, sat down next to her. The relief on his face was evident, but so was his concern for Jessica. He knew that, although the battle had been won, the scars left behind were deep. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice soft as he took her hand. Jessica looked at Michael, feeling a swirl of emotions. She wanted to say she was relieved, that she felt free, but the truth was more complex. The wounds Richard had inflicted, both on her life and her heart, wouldn't disappear with his arrest. "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "I thought I'd feel some sort of release, that everything would end when he was gone, but now, I'm not sure what comes next." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "What you did was incredible," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "You faced him, defeated him, and now you're free. But it's normal that not everything feels perfect right away. What's important is that now you're in control of your life, and from here you can decide how to move forward." Jessica knew Michael was right. but she also understood that the process wouldn't be easy. Richard's betrayal, the lies and the deceit, had left deep scars. But now she had something she hadn't had before. Choices. And with Michael by her side, she felt she could start to heal, even if it was little by little. "Thank you," she finally said, looking at Michael with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Michael smiled softly and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do it alone," he said warmly. "I'm here, and I'll be here for as long as you need me." Jessica felt a comforting warmth, hearing those words, and though she knew the road ahead would be long, for the first time in a long time, she felt she wasn't facing the future alone. In the following days, Jessica's world began to change quickly. The media continued covering the scandal that had fallen upon Richard, and the investigations against him kept revealing more details of his crimes. Richard Perez's downfall was the topic of conversation in every social circle, and those who had once revered him now condemned him. However, Jessica stayed out of the media frenzy. With William and Michael's help, she ensured that her involvement in bringing down Richard wasn't publicly revealed. She didn't want to be seen as either a victim or a heroine. All she wanted now was peace. With Richard out of the picture, the mansion felt emptier than ever. Jessica knew she had to make decisions about what she would do next. What would she do with the house? How would she rebuild her life without the chains that had once bound her? One morning, while walking through the garden, she decided it was time to leave the past behind, once and for all. The mansion, with all its luxury and dark memories, was no longer a place where she could find peace. It had been a symbol of Richard's control, and now it represented everything she wanted to leave behind. That same afternoon, she met with a real estate agent. She decided to sell the property and use the money to start a new life, far from the memories that haunted her. It was a symbolic step, but an important one. Selling the house meant leaving that part of her life behind once and for all. A week later, Jessica and Michael stood in front of a small house in a quiet coastal town, far from the noise of the city and everything that had happened. Michael had suggested the place as a temporary refuge, a space where they could start over, without the shadows of the past chasing them. "It's simple, but I think it'll be perfect for you," Michael said as they both looked at the house. "Here, you can have the peace you need." Jessica looked at him, feeling a relief she hadn't felt in a long time. She had spent so long trapped in Richard's web that she had forgotten what it was like to live without fear, without the weight of constant manipulation. "It's perfect," she finally said, smiling, as she turned to take in the sea stretching out before them. For the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a genuine sense of freedom. The sea air was fresh and comforting, and as she breathed it in, she felt the scars beginning to heal, even if it was little by little. "And what comes next?" Michael asked, smiling as he watched her. Jessica took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon with a new perspective. "I don't know," she replied honestly, "but I think that's the exciting part. For the first time, the future is in my hands, and I can build it however I want." Michael nodded, understanding the importance of her words. They had come a long way, and although there were still challenges ahead, both knew that together they could face them. "We'll build it together," he said, stepping closer to take her hand. Jessica looked at him, smiling, and nodded. Though the future was uncertain, she was no longer afraid. She knew that, with Michael by her side, she would have the strength and courage to move forward. Life was finally offering her a new chance, and Jessica was ready to take it. As the sun began to set on the horizon, Jessica and Michael remained together, watching as the day slowly faded into the sea. From now on, everything would be different, and for the first time, Jessica felt truly free. The small coastal house had become a refuge for Jessica. The sea breeze, the peaceful sunrises, and the simplicity of her new life helped her heal the wounds she had accumulated over the years. Although Richard was no longer part of her life, the weight of the memories lingered. But in that corner of the world, little by little, Jessica was learning to let go. Michael had also found unexpected peace in the town's tranquility. His days were filled with long walks on the beach and deep conversations with Jessica about what would come next. They both knew that although the past was behind them, there were still things to resolve. However, for the moment, they preferred to live in the present. One morning, while Jessica was organizing the few pieces of furniture in the house, she received an unexpected call. It was from Emily, her younger sister, with whom she hadn't spoken since she began confronting Richard. Emily had always been a reminder of the choices Jessica made to protect her, and that emotional distance between them had been hard to bridge. "Jessica," Emily said softly on the other end of the line, "I've been following the news about Richard, everything that's happened." Jessica remained silent for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the past creeping back into her life. "Yes," she finally replied. "It's been complicated, but I'm starting over." Emily sighed on the other end. "I know, and I'm glad you're doing well, Dee, but there's something I need to tell you." Jessica felt a knot in her stomach. Her relationship with Emily had been distant for a long time, and now, after everything that had happened, she knew this call could be the start of a conversation they had avoided for years. "What is it?" she asked cautiously. "It's about Dad," Emily replied, her voice lowering. "I've discovered something about him, something I never dared to tell you when you were living with Richard. I always thought you knew, but now I'm not so sure." Jessica's heart raced. The topic of their father had always been delicate. Richard's betrayal had tainted her memories of him, but her love for her father had never completely disappeared. What could Emily have found that was so important now? "Emily, what did you find?" Jessica asked, her voice more tense than she intended. "Dad never wanted to betray Richard," Emily said slowly. "It was all Richard's manipulation to ensure that you married him. I realized it when I went through some old family papers. There's proof that Dad tried to distance himself from Richard, but he was threatened and forced to stay in the business." Jessica's world seemed to stop for a moment. For years, she had believed that her father had been part of the dark web Richard had created, and that his death had been a consequence of his poor choices. But if what Emily was saying was true, everything she believed about her father and his role in Richard's scheme was yet another lie. "Are you sure?" Jessica asked, trying to process what she had just heard. "Yes," Emily replied. "I've found letters and documents that prove it. I don't know why I didn't find them before, but now I understand why Dad was so distant in his last months. He was trying to protect us, and Richard destroyed him." Jessica felt a mix of anger and sadness flood her heart. Richard's betrayal had been deeper than she imagined. Not only had he manipulated her, but he had also tarnished her father's memory, covering him with a guilt he didn't deserve. "I'll send you everything I have," Emily continued. "You need to see it for yourself. You need to know the truth." Jessica nodded, even though her sister couldn't see her. There were too many emotions swirling inside her, but there was also a sense of resolution. She needed to know the truth about her father, even if it meant reopening old wounds. "Thank you, Emily," she finally said. "Thank you for telling me." "I've always loved you, Jessica," Emily responded, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'm sorry I wasn't closer when you needed me." Jessica closed her eyes, feeling a tear slide down her cheek. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I'm glad we can finally talk about this." After hanging up, Jessica sat in silence, processing the conversation. Emily's revelations had stirred a part of her she thought she had buried. Her father had been a complicated figure in her life, but now, with this new information, she felt she needed to honor his memory in some way. That afternoon, as they walked along the beach, Jessica told Michael what her sister had revealed. Michael listened in silence, absorbing the implications. "What are you going to do now?" he asked when Jessica finished speaking. Jessica stopped, watching the waves gently crash against the shore. The wind blew her hair, but she barely noticed. She knew that to close this chapter of her life, she needed to do something for her father's memory. "I can't let my father's story end like this," she finally replied. If Richard tarnished his memory, I need to clear his name. My father deserves to have the truth revealed. Michael looked at her with a mix of admiration and understanding. If you decide to do this, I'll be by your side, Ma, he said. But I know reviving all this won't be easy. Jessica nodded, knowing Michael was right. Facing the ghosts of the past would be painful, but she could no longer live under the lies Richard had created. I know, she murmured, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth always comes to light, and I'm ready to face it, no matter what it costs. Michael smiled and took her hand as they continued walking along the beach. Jessica felt that the path to peace was still long, but with each step she took, she felt she was a little closer to healing the wounds of the past. As the sun began to set on the horizon, Jessica knew that the next chapter of her life would be one of justice and reconciliation. Though the pain remained, so did her strength, and with Michael by her side, she was ready to face it all. The letters and documents Emily had sent arrived a few days later in a carefully wrapped package. When she received it, Jessica felt a wave of nervousness. The answers she had been seeking for years were now in her hands, and while she wanted to know the truth, she also feared what that truth might reveal. Michael watched her from the doorway as Jessica sat at the dining table with the package in front of her. He knew this moment was pivotal for her, and that the words contained in those letters could forever change her perception of her father. "Take your time," he said gently. "You don't have to do it alone if you don't want to." Jessica nodded, appreciating his presence, but she knew this part of the journey she had to take on her own. She opened the package with trembling hands and began to pull out the documents. The first thing she found were several handwritten letters, some addressed to her, some to Emily, and others that appeared never to have been sent. She began reading one of the first letters her father had written shortly before his death. In it, he described his regret for becoming involved in Richard's business, but also explained that he had been manipulated and threatened. Richard had used Jessica as leverage, threatening to ruin her life if her father didn't cooperate. "I never wanted to drag you into this, daughter." One of the lines that struck Jessica the most read, "I did everything I could to protect you, but I failed. Richard is more dangerous than we ever imagined, and I fear that if I don't do what he asks, he will destroy you. My only hope is that one day you'll understand that everything I did was out of love for you and Emily." Jessica set the letter aside, her heart pounding. Her father's words were like a slap of reality. All that time, she had believed he had willingly collaborated with Richard, but now she saw that he had been yet another victim of her ex-husband's manipulations. The following letters revealed a similar pattern. Her father had tried to sever ties with Richard, but every attempt had been squashed by threats and coercion. Richard had not only used his financial and political power to control her father, but had also ensured that Jessica would be trapped in the same cycle. "I can't believe it," Jessica murmured, as she flipped through page after page, increasingly absorbed in the truth. Michael, who had been watching silently, approached and sat next to her. "What does it say?" he asked softly. Jessica took a deep breath before answering. "My father. He was never the man I thought he was. Richard controlled him, threatened him. He did all this to protect me, to keep my life from being destroyed, and I spent years believing the opposite, believing he was part of the problem." Michael nodded, squeezing Jessica's hand with understanding. "What Richard did is unforgivable," Michael said firmly. "He manipulated and destroyed everything in his path, but now you know the truth, and that's what matters." Jessica let out a long, deep sigh. Despite the pain of discovering what had really happened, she also felt a release. She finally understood her father's role in all of this, and although she couldn't change the past, she could make peace with it. "I'm going to clear his name," Jessica said with determination. "Richard made everyone think my father was his partner, that he was involved in his crimes, but I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. My father deserves to be remembered for who he really was, a man who tried to save us." Michael nodded, seeing the spark of resolve in Jessica's eyes. He knew this would be another challenge, but he also knew Jessica was stronger than ever. "How do you plan to do it?" he asked as Jessica gathered the papers and letters. "I'm going to contact the journalists who helped expose Richard," Jessica said, already forming a plan in her mind. "If I give them these proofs, they'll be able to tell the whole story. People need to know who my father really was." Michael looked at her with pride. "I'm with you on this, Jessica," he said with a smile. "Whatever you need, count on me." Jessica nodded, feeling a new surge of energy wash over her. For years she had been a victim of Richard's lies, but now she had the power to change that narrative. She was going to clear her father's name, and she wouldn't let Richard's legacy stain her life any longer. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and evidence searches. Jessica contacted the same journalists who had helped expose Richard and presented them with the letters and documents Emily had found. The journalists, upon reviewing the evidence, were impressed by the amount of information they revealed and by the impact it would have on the narrative surrounding Richard and her father. Once the journalists began publishing the truth, public perception quickly shifted. The media, which had previously painted her father as a willing partner of Richard, now recognized that he had been manipulated and threatened into collaborating with him. Articles and reports detailing the real story of her father began to circulate, and Jessica felt that, little by little, justice was being served. However, it wasn't all easy. There were critics who still doubted the authenticity of the documents and tried to discredit Jessica's efforts. But she wasn't intimidated. Every time someone questioned the evidence, Jessica responded with firmness, defending her father's legacy and the truth she had fought so hard to uncover. As the days passed, Jessica felt the weight on her chest lighten. The truth had come to light, and although the pain of the lost years was still present, so was the satisfaction of having done the right thing. One morning, as she read an article describing how her father had tried to sever ties with Richard, Jessica felt that she had finally closed that chapter of her life. It wasn't the happy ending she had imagined, but it was an ending filled with justice, and that was what mattered most. That night, as they walked along the beach, Michael asked her how she felt now that everything was over. "Free," Jessica replied with a sincere smile. "I finally feel like the past doesn't control me anymore. I've made peace with my father, and although I can't change what happened, I know I did the right thing by clearing his name." Michael nodded, embracing her as they walked. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You've come a long way." Jessica leaned on him, watching the waves gently break on the shore. She knew the future was still uncertain, but now she saw it with a new sense of hope. The truth had come to light, and with it, the weight of the past had lifted. From that moment on, Jessica was ready to face whatever life brought her, with the strength and courage she had discovered within herself. With her father's name finally cleared and Richard's legacy destroyed, Jessica felt that the wind had changed. She had endured so many trials, so many struggles, but at last she saw the horizon clear before her. Yet despite this liberation, she also knew there was a new life ahead, a life she had to build from scratch. The small coastal town had become her refuge, a place where the storms of the past could no longer reach her. Every morning, Jessica rose early and went for a walk along the beach, feeling the sand under her feet and the sound of the waves bringing back the peace she had lost. Michael often accompanied her, and together they shared moments of tranquility, far from the noise of the outside world. One day, while Jessica was having coffee on the small terrace of the house, Michael approached with a smile she now recognized as a sign that something was coming. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting down beside her. "Now that everything is over and you can finally breathe, I think you should consider something more, something that allows you to move forward in a different way." Jessica raised an eyebrow, curious about what Michael had in mind. "What do you mean?" she asked, sipping her coffee. Michael took a deep breath, thoughtful. "I know this town has given you the peace you needed, but I also know you're a strong and passionate woman. You've been through so much, you've faced so many challenges, And I think now is the perfect time for you to think about what you want to build next. Something beyond this refuge. Maybe a new project. Something you're passionate about." Jessica stared at him in silence, surprised by his words. She knew Michael was right. She had found peace in the tranquility of the village, but deep in her heart, she knew she wanted to do something more, something meaningful. Her father's words in the letters still echoed in her mind, and with everything she had learned throughout her life, she felt she had more to offer. "Do you have something in mind?" she asked, observing Michael with a slight smile, knowing he had already thought of something. Michael smiled back as if waiting for that question. "I've been talking to some contacts," he began, "and they told me about a nearby city where a group of entrepreneurial women are looking to establish a foundation to support women who have been victims of manipulation and abuse, just like you were. They need someone who can inspire them, guide them, someone who knows what it's like to fight through the shadows of the past." Jessica felt her heart skip a beat. The idea resonated deep within her. She had spent so much time dealing with Richard's control, with the lies and manipulation, and she had come out stronger than ever. Maybe helping other women in similar situations could be her new purpose. "That sounds incredible," she murmured, feeling an emotion she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Do you really think I can do that? Help other women like me?" Michael looked at her with admiration, as he had so many times before. "Jessica, if there's anyone who can do it, it's you," he said sincerely. "You've shown incredible strength and resilience. Your story, your fight can inspire so many other women to find their own strength and escape the shadows surrounding them." Jessica stayed silent, processing the idea. She had spent so much time dealing with her own pain and confusion that she had never allowed herself to think about how her experience could help others. But now, after everything she had overcome, she felt it was time to do something meaningful. "I think you're right," she said finally, her voice firm and determined. "It's time I do something with everything I've learned. If I can help other women reclaim their lives, then everything I've been through will have been worth it." Michael smiled, clearly relieved to see that Jessica had made her decision. He knew this was the next step in her healing, not just for herself, but for all the women who, like her, had silently suffered for so long. "When do we start?" Jessica asked with a spark in her eyes, showing a renewed enthusiasm. Michael leaned forward, smiling conspiratorially. "I've already spoken with one of the project leaders. They're organizing a meeting in a few days, and if you want, I can make the arrangements for you to join. I believe it'll be the first step towards something amazing." The following days were a whirlwind of excitement for Jessica. For the first time in a long time, she felt she had a purpose, something that moved her beyond her own story. Michael made the arrangements, and soon Jessica was invited to a meeting with the entrepreneurial women behind the foundation. The meeting was a revealing moment for Jessica. In that room, surrounded by women sharing stories of overcoming and struggle, she felt at home. Each of them had faced their own challenges, but together they were determined to create a space where other women could find support, advice, and hope. When it was her turn to speak, Jessica shared her story. She spoke about her father, about Richard, about the manipulation and pain she had suffered for years. But she also talked about how she had found her strength, how she had moved forward, and finally how she had cleared her father's name. The women in the room listened intently, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding silently as if understanding every word she said. In the end, Jessica knew she had found her place. This was the next chapter of her life, and she was ready to write it. Back in the small coastal village, Jessica and Michael continued building their life together. The foundation became a central part of their routine, and Jessica soon took on a key role in the project, helping design programs and workshops for women in need of support. Each day she saw how her pain transformed into a tool for healing and empowering others. One afternoon, as they walked along the beach after a long day, Michael took Jessica's hand, as he often did. "How do you feel?" he asked softly as the sun began to set on the horizon. Jessica smiled, looking out at the sea stretching before them. "For the first time in a long time," she replied, "I feel at peace, and I feel that everything I went through, every battle, led me to this moment." Michael looked at her with tenderness. "I knew you would make it," he said, embracing her. "Now you're where you've always belonged." Jessica hugged him back, feeling the warmth of his love and the relief of having come so far. The past no longer controlled her, and the future was full of possibilities. Although the scars remained, they no longer defined her life. Jessica was finally in control of her destiny. The evening had turned dark and stormy, reflecting the chaos about to erupt in Jessica's house. For weeks, Richard had been on probation, having gotten out of jail through a complex legal maneuver orchestrated by his allies in the corrupt world he controlled. He had manipulated the judicial system and bribed certain officials, securing his release while keeping silent about the evidence against him. Richard's desperation to regain power and exact revenge had pushed him to the point of no return. Jessica was at the Foundation's office, reviewing critical documents, when Michael called her with palpable urgency. "Jessica, you need to come home immediately. Richard is here and he doesn't seem to be alone." Fear gripped Jessica as she hung up the phone and rushed home. When she arrived, she found the door ajar and a deathly silence in the air, broken only by the sounds of a heated argument coming from the living room. With her heart pounding, Jessica entered and saw Richard and Michael locked in a physical confrontation. Richard, his face red with rage, was in a fierce struggle with Michael, who was fighting to restrain him. The movements were rough and violent, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. The living room was a mess with overturned furniture and scattered objects all over the floor. "Jessica, get out of here," Michael shouted, his voice filled with desperation as he tried to hold Richard back. Richard turned to Jessica, his eyes cold and full of hatred. The situation had escalated quickly. She knew Richard had come with revenge in mind, but the level of violence was more than she had anticipated. "Don't get your hopes up, Jessica," Richard said with a cruel smile. "You haven't just taken everything from me, you're going to pay for it." Suddenly, Richard pulled out a small device from his jacket. It was a homemade explosive detonator, something he had prepared as a last resort to destroy everything if his plan failed. He began manipulating it with trembling hands as Michael lunged at him in a desperate attempt to disarm him. "Richard, stop!" Jessica shouted, running toward him. "You don't have to do this." Richard laughed maniacally as he continued fiddling with the device. The tension in the room reached its peak when Mikkel managed to grab Richard's arm, trying to wrench him away from the detonator. The struggle became even more violent, with both men wrestling over the device. In the chaos, the device fell to the ground and started making alarming noises. Jessica, her heart in her throat, tried to deactivate the mechanism, but the situation was desperate. The wires and buttons were confusing and time was running out. In an unexpected turn, Richard managed to shove Michael, sending him crashing to the floor. With a look of determination, Michael staggered to his feet, while Jessica continued trying to disable the device using her knowledge of electronics. Suddenly, a partial explosion erupted. Despite Jessica's efforts, the device didn't fully deactivate. The explosion brought down part of the ceiling and scattered debris throughout the room, throwing Jessica and Michael across the room. Jessica crashed into a wall, feeling a sharp pain in her side. Michael was thrown to the ground, bleeding profusely from a head wound. Richard, amid the chaos, was trapped under a fallen beam, his screams of fury drowned out by the dust and debris. Jessica crawled toward Michael, struggling to stay conscious. The room was in ruins and smoke filled the air. With difficulty, Jessica reached Michael and shook him forcefully. "Michael, wake up!" she cried, her voice trembling. Michael slowly opened his eyes, his face pale and his breathing irregular. Both were gravely injured, but they knew they had to act quickly. Meanwhile, Jessica's efforts to find a way out led her to discover that Richard was trapped under the debris, unable to move. With the last of her strength, Jessica approached him, who lay injured and furious. "Your reign of terror is over, Richard," Jessica said, her voice strained. "No more harm, no more lies." Minutes later, the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky with warm shades of red and orange. Jessica's house, which had been the scene of so much chaos and despair, now seemed wrapped in an eerie calm. The explosion and confrontation had left their mark, but the storm had passed, and what remained was the reconstruction of lives and dreams. Jessica and Michael were found injured, but alive. The partial explosion had caused severe damage to the house, and both were immediately taken to the hospital. Jessica had multiple fractures and a concussion, while Michael had a broken leg and various contusions. The recovery would be long and painful, but at least they had survived, and Richard had been trapped under the rubble, unable to cause further harm. Richard, on the other hand, was rearrested and sent back to prison, this time without any chance of escape. The truth about his crimes and the manipulation he had exerted became a major scandal, and his reign of terror came to a definitive end. The days in the hospital were difficult for both of them. Doctors and nurses worked to heal their physical wounds, while the weight of the tragedy and emotional trauma settled over them. In their hospital rooms, Jessica and Michael had time to reflect on everything that had happened, on their lives, and what the future held. A week after the confrontation, both were discharged. Jessica's house was in ruins and needed a complete rebuild, and although the foundation had escaped the crisis unscathed, it needed to be reorganized. Jessica and Michael found themselves in the hospital garden, having a private conversation that would likely be decisive for their future. "I can't believe everything we've been through," Jessica said, looking at the ground with sadness. "It was beyond what I could have imagined. I lost so much, but at the same time I gained a new perspective on life." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know, and although we've overcome this, I think there's something we need to discuss. This time in the hospital and the way we've come through all of this has given me a lot to think about." Jessica looked at him, feeling a mix of hope and concern. She knew Michael was about to say something important, something that would change the course of their lives. "What are you trying to say, Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Jessica, we've been through so much together. You've shown incredible strength and a generous heart. I admire and respect you deeply. But despite everything we've been through, and the feelings that have arisen between us, I think the best thing for both of us is to part ways." Jessica felt a knot in her stomach. The pain of those words was sharp, but she also understood the truth behind them. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Can't we find a way to move forward together?" Michael looked at her with sad but sincere eyes. "It's not that I don't care for you, Jessica. It's the opposite. But what we've lived through has been incredibly intense and traumatic. We need time to heal, to rebuild our lives separately before we can even consider any future together. Our paths, at least for now, need to be apart so that we can find true peace and recovery." Jessica nodded, tears filling her eyes. The pain of separation was immense, but she understood the need for space and healing. "You're right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to find who we really are outside of this storm, and maybe in time we can find a way to get back on the right path, even if now it's apart." Michael gently took her hand, a gesture of comfort and care. "What we've lived through will always be part of us. I can't deny the connection we have, but we both deserve the chance to find peace and stability. I want you to be happy, Jessica, and for that to happen, we need to give ourselves the time and space to heal." At that moment, the sun rose above them, lighting the hospital garden with a golden glow. They shared one last embrace, feeling the weight of goodbye but also the hope of a new beginning. They knew life would bring more challenges and opportunities, and though their paths were diverging, they carried with them the memory of a deep and meaningful connection. The foundation was rebuilt on new foundations, thanks to Jessica's effort and dedication. Michael, for his part, decided to take some time to travel and rediscover himself. Though their paths had split, they each found renewed purpose and inner strength that allowed them to move forward. On the horizon of their lives, Hope and the possibility of a new future shone brightly. Tragedy and struggle had left scars, but they had also planted the seeds of resilience and transformation. And though the chapter of their relationship had ended, Jessica and Michael's story continued, each on their own journey toward peace and personal fulfillment. And that's how we end this chapter, full of intense emotions and deep reflections. Sometimes, the path to inner peace means saying goodbye to what we love most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring stories of courage and transformation. Remember, no matter how life tests us, there's always an opportunity to start anew. See you in the next video.